My name is Grace. I'm 35 years old. And the day that shattered everything wasn't when I lost 3 members of my unit to an IED outside Fallujah, or when shrapnel from a mortar attack left scars across my back that would never fully fade. It was standing in our kitchen in Phoenix last November, watching my husband Marcus slide divorce papers across the granite countertop while his mother Margaret stood behind him like a disapproving judge delivering a final verdict. "A woman who goes to war can never be a real wife," Marcus said, not bothering to look at me while he delivered the line his family had been rehearsing for months. "The nightmares, the anger, the way you jump at every sound, this isn't what I signed up for." Margaret nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions had finally been confirmed. "Military women are damaged goods, Marcus. You deserve someone whole." Damaged goods. The words hit harder than any roadside bomb I'd survived in 3 deployments. To them, I wasn't Grace, the combat veteran who'd earned 2 bronze stars and a Purple Heart. I wasn't the woman who'd saved lives under fire while they slept safely in suburban beds I'd helped protect. I was just broken, unworthy of love because I'd chosen service over safety. The kitchen in our Fairfax County colonial felt like a courtroom where I'd been sentenced before the trial even started. November light filtered through windows that overlooked a neighborhood where American flags hung from porches and yellow ribbon magnets decorated SUVs, the kind of suburban patriotism that honored veterans from a safe distance, but I couldn't handle having one at the breakfast table. Marcus sat across from me at the granite island we'd picked out together 3 years ago when we thought we were building something permanent. The divorce papers were spread between us like evidence in a case I'd lost before I knew I was being tried. His coffee was still steaming. Mine had gone cold while I read through legal language that dissolved 4 years of marriage into property division and irreconcilable differences. "Sign here," he said, pointing to a line that would officially transform me from disappointed wife into discarded burden. His voice carried that mixture of relief and embarrassment that husbands use when they're finally disposing of problems they should never have taken on. Behind him, I could see Margaret through the sliding glass doors, his mother, standing on our deck like she owned it, talking on her phone with the animated gestures of someone sharing good news, probably calling her book club friends to announce that Marcus had finally come to his senses about his mistake of a marriage. "You'll never be enough, Grace," Marcus continued, not looking at me while he delivered the speech he'd clearly practiced. "I didn't marry a soldier. I wanted a wife. Someone who could be normal. Someone who wouldn't wake up screaming from nightmares about places I'll never understand." Normal. The word hit our kitchen like incoming artillery, finding its target with precision that came from months of careful aim. "You jump every time a car backfires," he pressed on, warming to his theme while I sat there absorbing his assessment, like I'd absorbed shrapnel in Fallujah silently, because crying would only prove his point. "You can't watch movies with explosions. You check locks 3 times before bed. That's not a wife, Grace. That's a patient." A patient. While he'd been building his insurance career in climate-controlled office buildings, I'd been earning injuries that required patient care, scars across my back from mortar fragments, nerve damage in my left hand that made it hard to grip things when the weather changed, and nightmares that came with memories of soldiers who'd died in my arms while their mothers back home were probably planning Christmas dinners they'd never attend. But there was no way to explain that without seeming to prove his point about my inability to move past experiences he'd never have the courage to face. "My family's been very patient with you," Marcus added, glancing toward his mother who was wrapping up her phone call and preparing to join our dissolution proceedings. "But they can see what I've been too kind to admit. Military women are damaged goods. You can't turn off the soldier and become a real wife." Damaged goods. The phrase landed in our kitchen like a grenade with the pin pulled, designed to explode everything I'd thought I knew about love, marriage, and the kind of partnership that was supposed to survive for better or worse. Margaret slid the glass door open with theatrical timing, entering our conversation like a prosecutor who'd been waiting for her cue. "Marcus is making the right choice," she announced to no one in particular, settling into the bar stool beside her son with the satisfaction of someone whose advice had finally been taken. "Grace, dear, you're not equipped for marriage. The military changed you in ways that can't be fixed." Changed you in ways that can't be fixed. While she'd been attending charity luncheons and book club meetings, I'd been changing in ways that kept her son safe to attend business conferences and golf tournaments without worrying about roadside bombs or sniper fire. "I've seen it before," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the authority of someone who'd watched too many Lifetime movies about troubled veterans. Women who go to war come back broken. It's not your fault. But it's not fair to expect my son to live with the consequences. The consequences, like earning 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, were character flaws rather than recognition for courage under fire. Like serving 3 deployments in combat zones was a lifestyle choice that had inconvenienced their suburban dinner parties rather than service that had protected the freedom they exercised to judge me. I looked at these people I'd shared holidays with, who'd attended our wedding and smiled in family photos, now explaining why I was unfit for the institution I'd tried to honor while serving the country they claimed to support. "Grace," Marcus said, his tone shifting to the false kindness people use when they're explaining difficult decisions they've already made, "this is better for both of us. You can focus on whatever therapy you need, and I can find someone who fits my life. Someone who fits my life." While I'd been fitting my life around deployments that protected American interests in places he couldn't find on a map, he'd been planning his future around someone who wouldn't wake up with flashbacks to firefights that had saved soldiers' lives. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was that the broken woman they were discarding had classified achievements that would make international headlines if they were ever declassified. That their damaged goods had prevented terrorist attacks that would have targeted the very suburban neighborhoods where they felt safe to discuss my inadequacies. But sitting in our kitchen, surrounded by granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that represented the American dream I'd fought to protect, I felt exactly like what they said I was. Too damaged for love, too changed for normal life, too marked by service to deserve the kind of partnership that survived peacetime. I signed the papers with handwriting that was steady despite the nerve damage and my left-hand injuries sustained while carrying a wounded Marine to a medevac helicopter under enemy fire while Marcus had been safe in college, studying risk management and complaining about student loans. My wedding ring came off easier than I'd expected. 3 years of wearing it had left a pale band around my finger that would fade within months, leaving no visible evidence that someone had once promised to love me through better or worse. I dropped the ring into Marcus's coffee cup. The sound it made, a sharp clink against ceramic, felt like closing a door on 4 years of trying to be small enough for someone else's suburban dreams. Margaret smiled with genuine satisfaction. Marcus nodded like he'd just solved a problem that had been bothering him for months. Both of them certain they'd made the right decision about the woman who'd been too broken by service to deserve their continued tolerance. What they couldn't know was that in 3 months, when the Presidential Unit Citation Ceremony made national news, they'd discover exactly who they'd thrown away. That their patient was about to receive recognition from the Commander-in-Chief for actions that had saved American lives, while they'd been worried about her ability to attend dinner parties without embarrassing them. But that afternoon, walking out of the house we'd bought together, carrying a duffel bag that contained everything they'd decided I deserved to keep, I was just Grace, the failed wife. The woman too damaged by service to fit into the life someone else had planned. The nightmares came in fragments, scattered pieces of memories I couldn't discuss with the VA counselors who assumed they understood combat trauma. The sound of rotors cutting through Helmand Province air. Radio chatter that meant American lives hung in the balance while I coordinated strikes that would never appear in any official after-action report. Falcon 7, coordinates confirmed. Package is hot, clear to engage. But I always woke up before the part where I saved them. Always jolted awake in my studio apartment in Arlington, sheets soaked with sweat, heart pounding from missions that had been classified so far above top secret that even my DD-214 discharge papers contained lies about what I'd actually done for my country. 6 months after the divorce, I was substitute teaching at Jefferson Elementary, $120 a day when they needed me, which was maybe twice a week if I was lucky. Former Special Activities Division operatives don't qualify for many civilian jobs when their entire service record has been sanitized to protect operations that most Pentagon officials weren't cleared to know about. The other teachers were kind enough, polite. They'd heard through suburban gossip networks that I was the divorced military woman who'd been too damaged for marriage, and they treated me with the careful sympathy reserved for people whose problems everyone understood but nobody wanted to catch. Such a shame about Grace, I heard Mrs. Peterson tell Mrs. Williams during lunch duty. Couldn't make it work with that nice insurance man. But you know how military women are, they never really adjust back to normal life. Normal life. While they discussed lesson plans and parent conferences, I was managing flashbacks to briefings where Pentagon officials had explained why my next mission would require me to accept a cover story that made my real achievements disappear into classified files that would remain sealed for décades. But sitting in that elementary school cafeteria, watching them navigate the complex social dynamics of suburban educators, I felt exactly like what they thought I was. Someone whose best years were behind her, whose greatest achievements were unknowable, whose future consisted of substitute teaching and VA appointments. The memory always hit the same way, sudden, complete, like stepping on an IED that had been waiting years to detonate. 3 months before my discharge, a windowless room in Langley, where a 2-star general had explained why preventing the Mumbai-style terrorist attack on American soil would require me to become someone who'd never existed. Major Thompson, he'd said, using a name that wasn't on any official roster, what we're asking you to do will erase your real service record. Your family will never know. Your achievements will be classified at levels that don't officially exist. You'll receive recognition that can never be made public. I'd accepted those terms. Signed papers that meant my actual military career would remain hidden while my official record showed conventional deployment patterns and standard decorations that didn't reflect preventing what intelligence estimated would have been the deadliest terrorist attack in American history. But standing in that elementary school hallway, pinning up construction paper turkeys while kindergartners talked about what they were thankful for, I felt like someone whose sacrifices had been so thoroughly buried that even I was starting to forget they'd happened. That's when every television in Jefferson Elementary started broadcasting breaking news that changed everything. This is CNN with urgent breaking news. Terrorists have seized control of the Meridian Tower in downtown Washington, taking approximately 300 hostages, including federal employees, congressional staff, and private sector executives attending a Veterans Day reception. 300 hostages. I stopped hanging paper turkeys and stared at the classroom television, while Mrs. Peterson explained to confused kindergartners why their planned Thanksgiving activities were being interrupted by adult emergencies they couldn't understand. The footage was exactly what I'd spent years preventing: armed men in tactical gear moving through a downtown skyscraper while news helicopters circled overhead and emergency responders established perimeters that would be useless if the terrorists followed the playbook intelligence agencies had been tracking for months. That's when I saw him on the hostage list scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Marcus Thompson, Executive Vice President, Meridian Insurance Group. My ex-husband. The man who divorced me for being too damaged by military service to fit into his suburban life. Trapped on the 47th floor of a building that had just become ground zero for the kind of attack I'd once been tasked with preventing. My phone vibrated against my hip, not the cheerful chime of text messages or the standard ring of normal calls, but the sharp buzz pattern I hadn't heard since my discharge. Emergency activation code that bypassed civilian networks and connected directly to operations centers most government employees didn't know existed. I stepped into the supply closet and answered on the second buzz. Thompson, using the name that wasn't on any official records but was encoded into emergency contact systems that activated personnel who officially didn't exist. Major, this is Colonel Hayes, Joint Special Operations Command. We have a situation that requires immediate activation of Phoenix protocols. How quickly can you reach the district? Phoenix protocols, the emergency response procedures for domestic terrorist incidents that required operators with specific skill sets and security clearances that took years to obtain. The kind of missions where failure meant CNN would be broadcasting casualty counts instead of rescue operations. I'm 20 minutes from the district, I said, my mind automatically calculating routes and response times while kindergarten laughter echoed through the supply closet door. What's the tactical situation? 12 hostiles, unknown weapon systems, 300 civilian hostages including federal personnel with high-level clearances. Standard hostage rescue teams can't risk the collateral damage. We need someone who can go in surgical and come out clean. Someone who could go in surgical and come out clean. While substitute teachers worried about construction paper supplies and parent conferences, the Pentagon was calling the woman they needed when conventional forces weren't sufficient. I'll be there in 15, I said, feeling muscles I hadn't used in months, automatically preparing for operations that most people only saw in movies. Major, Colonel Hayes added, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what he was asking. This is the scenario we've been preparing for since Mumbai. Everything you trained for. Everything you sacrificed your civilian life to be ready for. Everything I sacrificed my civilian life to be ready for. While Marcus had been building his insurance career and explaining to his mother why I was too damaged for marriage, I'd been maintaining readiness for missions that would never appear in any public record but would determine whether American families went home safely or became statistics. I hung up and walked back into the kindergarten classroom where Mrs. Peterson was trying to explain to confused 5-year-olds why the scary pictures on television meant they'd have to wait until tomorrow for their Thanksgiving party. "I have to go," I told her, my voice steady despite the adrenaline that was already shifting my body chemistry from civilian to operational status. She looked at me with the same polite concern she'd shown for months the divorced substitute teacher whose personal problems were everybody's business but nobody's responsibility. What she couldn't know was that the failed wife was about to become the difference between 300 American lives and a terrorist attack that would dominate international headlines for decades. The woman Marcus had thrown away for being too damaged by military service was the only person qualified to save him from the consequences of enemies who understood Americans better than Americans understood themselves. I walked out of Jefferson Elementary carrying secrets that would die with me rather than compromise the safety of people who would never know how close they'd come to catastrophe. Some missions don't allow for recognition. Some sacrifices happen in rooms that don't officially exist. But when terrorists threaten Americans on American soil, the damaged goods become the only weapons sophisticated enough to stop them. Marcus was about to discover exactly what kind of woman he'd divorced. The Meridian Tower looked like a scene from America's worst nightmares: 47 floors of glass and steel wrapped in black smoke, news helicopters circling like mechanical vultures, while emergency lights painted downtown D.C. in the colors of catastrophe. Every major network was broadcasting live coverage as FBI negotiators tried to establish contact with terrorists who'd turned Veterans Day into something that would be remembered for entirely different reasons. I rappelled from the Black Hawk onto the roof at 14:32, exactly 18 minutes after walking out of Jefferson Elementary. The transition from substitute teacher to operational asset had taken less time than most people needed for their commute home. My tactical gear felt like returning to my true skin customized HK 416, Level 3 body armor, communication systems that connected me directly to operations centers that officially didn't exist. Equipment worth more than most people's houses, issued to personnel whose existence was classified but whose capabilities were essential when conventional forces weren't sufficient. The building was a maze of smoke, shattered glass, and civilian terror. 47 floors of hostile territory where 12 armed men had transformed a Veterans Day reception into an execution waiting to happen. 300 hostages who'd been celebrating American heroes, now depending on one to save them. I moved through the Meridian Tower like a ghost with lethal purpose, room by room, clearing operations perfected during missions that would never appear in any official record. Silent, surgical, devastating when necessary, invisible when possible. By 1547, I'd neutralized 8 terrorists and secured 280 hostages. The remaining targets were concentrated on the executive floor, with the final 20 hostages VIPs, whose capture had been the operation's primary objective, including federal employees with security clearances and private sector executives whose deaths would send shockwaves through American corporate leadership. That's when CNN's helicopter got close enough for their cameras to capture what would become the most watched rescue footage in television history. The elevator doors opened onto chaos. Marcus stood with zip-tied hands, surrounded by 4 men whose faces matched photographs from classified briefings about domestic terrorist cells that had been planning this operation for months. His executive confidence had been replaced by the blank terror of someone who'd discovered that real danger didn't respect insurance policies or suburban safety. He saw me before they did. His ex-wife, emerging from what should have been certain death, wearing tactical gear that transformed her from failed marriage casualty into America's response to international terrorism. Grace? The word escaped his lips like a prayer, but I wasn't Grace anymore. I was Major Thompson, and these terrorists had just made the mistake of taking American hostages while someone with my skill set was 18 minutes away. The engagement was everything I'd trained for, condensed into 37 seconds of precision violence broadcast live to 50 million Americans. The terrorist leader turned his AK-47 toward me with the confidence of someone who'd controlled the situation for hours. He'd made the same mistake Marcus had, underestimating what he was facing. I moved with muscle memory that came from operations in places that didn't exist on maps. eliminating threats with efficiency that looked effortless but represented years of training that had cost more than most college educations. The final terrorist went down hard, his weapon clattering across marble floors while I secured him with flex cuffs that clicked shut with the finality of justice served. Hostage situation resolved, I announced to news cameras that had captured everything, my voice carrying clearly across a nation that was witnessing their suburban divorce story transform into an international terrorism thriller. Building secure. All hostiles neutralized. Through shattered windows, I could see Anderson Cooper struggling to process what CNN's audience had just witnessed. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried across tactical communication frequencies, we're watching something unprecedented. The operative who just single-handedly rescued 300 American hostages appears to be Grace Thompson, whose classified military service record is being declassified by Pentagon officials as we speak. Classified military service record. While Margaret had been explaining to her book club why military women were damaged goods, the Department of Defense was revealing that her former daughter-in-law had prevented terrorist attacks that made today's incident look like a practice exercise. I looked at Marcus, this man who'd divorced me for being too broken by combat to deserve his suburban love, and saw recognition dawning in his eyes. Not the woman he'd discarded, but someone whose value he'd been too shallow to comprehend. The applause started with the hostages, grateful Americans who understood they were alive because someone had risked everything to reach them. Then it spread to the emergency responders, the news crews, the crowds gathered on streets below who'd watched their nightmare end with competence that redefined their understanding of what heroes looked like. She's a decorated special operations veteran, the CNN anchor continued, reading from information being fed to him by Pentagon press officials. Multiple deployments, classified achievements, recognition that has never been made public due to operational security requirements. That evening, as every major network explained to America that their failed military wife was someone whose achievements were classified at levels most government officials would never access, Marcus sat in our former living room confronting the magnitude of what he'd thrown away. Margaret clutched her pearls with hands that shook from something deeper than shock. The woman she'd called damaged goods had just been revealed as someone the Pentagon considered essential to national security. My God, she whispered to no one in particular, it's her. The woman Marcus. She couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't find words to acknowledge that they'd discarded someone who'd spent years protecting the freedom they'd used to judge her inadequate for suburban marriage. The coverage continued through the night analyses of my tactical approach, interviews with hostages who described the angel in combat gear who'd appeared when hope was gone, Pentagon officials explaining why my service record had been classified and why it was being revealed now. But the moment that would be replayed for decades came during the live broadcast, when cameras zoomed in on my face as I led the final group of hostages to safety. Not the broken veteran Marcus had divorced, but the weapon I'd always been patient, precise, deadly when necessary, invisible until the moment invisibility was no longer sufficient. The woman he'd called too damaged for love had just prevented what could have been the deadliest terrorist attack since 9/11. The patient he couldn't handle had been someone the Department of Defense activated when conventional solutions weren't adequate. The wife he'd thrown away for being changed by military service had used those changes to save 300 American lives, including his own. Some truths are too classified to share until the moment they become too important to hide. Some recognition comes only when it arrives too late to save what's already been destroyed. But that day, as America watched their damaged military wife become the face of successful counterterrorism operations, I finally understood that vindication doesn't require an audience that includes the people who refuse to see you. Sometimes it's enough to be seen by a nation that understands exactly what you've sacrificed to keep them safe. The man who divorced me for being a soldier had just watched the world applaud the woman he'd thrown away. And in the space between his recognition and my indifference, justice felt exactly like coming home. Grace's story reminds us that service takes many forms, that some sacrifices happen in silence, and that the people who judge veterans for being changed by their service often have no understanding of what those changes protected. Her story shows us that healing doesn't require the approval of those who never understood your worth. If this story moved you, if you've ever been judged for experiences others couldn't understand, or if you know a veteran whose service deserves recognition rather than judgment, share this video. Let it reach someone who needs to know their service matters, even when those closest to them can't see its value. Subscribe for more stories of unrecognized service. The veterans whose greatest achievements remain classified. The service members whose sacrifices protect freedoms others take for granted. The heroes whose worth transcends the judgment of people too comfortable to understand what protection costs. Because the most important question isn't whether people understand your service. It's whether you know that your sacrifices mattered, your courage protected others, and your worth exists independent of anyone else's ability to recognize it. Share this story with someone who's served, someone who's been judged for experiences others couldn't handle, or someone who needs to understand that veterans deserve support, not judgment. They thought my uniform made me less of a woman. The world learned it made me exactly what America needed.